All right. Here we go. Welcome. Hi. Good to see you again. I can't see you. I'm a master of computers. No, okay. I can't see you. I don't even know if you're there. Maybe no one's watching this. Maybe you left it on to entertain your dog. I don't know. But whoever is watching this, today we're going to keep talking about the European Middle Ages, the medieval era. Basically, it's French for Middle Ages. But okay. So welcome back. If you watched the last, well, not the last video was on Egypt. If you watched the last video in the right sequence, then you will know it was about the Dark Ages. And about Charlemagne, or Big Charlie as I like to call him, Charlemagne's attempt to yank Europe out of the Dark Ages, which did not work, and what the Dark Ages were and so on and so forth. Now, the medieval era as a whole, well, you can put it starting from maybe the fall of Rome, although some people like to call that late antiquity, if they're being pretentious. You could stick that maybe at the start of Rome, the fall of Rome, rather. Or you could take it all the way out to, you could push it all the way to the 8th century, where Charlemagne first starts really conquering big portions of Europe. I like to split the difference a little bit. I push it a little bit past the fall of Rome and call it maybe 6th century, at the latest early 7th, maybe 600. And that's because the key features of the medieval era, what I consider to be the key features of the medieval era, and when they really become prominent in Europe. So let's talk about those. It's going to be important to know what those are in order to understand what's going on in this period of history and how that changes. So the first key feature in the medieval era is feudalism. F-E-U-D-A-L-I-S-M. Feudalism, where society was based around the long game of family feud. No. My wife is giving me a disapproving look. Perhaps later, especially when we talk about plague, I will show you her stuffed plague doctor, called Dr. Womber. He's very adorable. I did not name him. She names all the stuffed animals in the house. She is going to be preparing a PowerPoint presentation on this very soon, and if enough people in class want to see it, I'll upload it to the website. Anyway, it'll be extra credits. How about that? Identify these stuffed animals for extra credit. She names all of them, and she remembers their names. It's remarkable. I can't remember all my relatives' names. She knows the names of all her stuffed animals. It's amazing. She's amazing. Anyway. Alright, so. Feudalism. Feudalism isn't a form of government, although I think the book refers to it as such. The book is wrong. The person who wrote it is wrong. Feudalism is a principle of social organization, which is a bit more elusive than a government. Government inherently, in some sense, government almost inherently implies almost implies a certain element of public life. Let me talk about that for a second. In our world, in our society, we have a private sphere and a public sphere. The private sphere is relationships, the personal relationships you have with people, friends, family, so on and so forth, maybe classmates, what have you. But in the public sphere, we have relationships with other people that are impersonal, that are mediated by institutions. Let me give you an example of what this means. This sounds very forbiddingly abstract, but I have a concrete example that people like. If you get to a four-way stop and someone else is at another part of the four-way stop, you do not have to get out and rely on personal interaction to figure out who goes next. There are rules. There are little lines in the road, there's a sign, and there are established rules, right? These rules are social institutions. They are created and enforced by the law enforcement institutions and the people, the institutions who pay people to put up signs, to draw lines on the road, right? All of that creates a framework for interaction where we both know, like me and the other person at the intersection, we know more or less what the other person is thinking and what to expect of them and how they're going to behave, even though we don't personally know each other, right? It's an impersonal interaction that is facilitated by, that is made possible by the existence of social institutions. That is an interaction in the public sphere. Okay? If you have a collision with someone, you call the cops and you exchange insurance information, right? And there are all these, you don't have a personal interaction. I mean, some people do. Some people will get out and yell at the person, try to frighten them, intimidate them, get very mad. But none of that's necessary. It's probably not something you should do. The interaction is impersonal. It is mediated by all of the legal institutions and the institutions of the insurance companies and so on and so forth. The entire interaction takes place sort of through this third party. The two primary parties, the people at the intersection or the people in the collision, are not interacting directly based on personal acquaintance and familiarity and intimate personal knowledge. They are not guaranteeing to each other by any personal means certain actions. No. You don't have to know anything about the person, the specific individual. All you have to know is that they're a member of the society and they're acquainted with these institutions, and that all things being equal, and generally on the whole, we can assume that people will act in the prescribed fashion. When I get to a four-way stop, I assume that people are going to follow the usual rules of the road. Mostly they do, right? The cynical among us will say, yeah, people never do that. But really they do, right? We can joke all we want about bad drivers. But the fact is, we would be unable to drive anywhere unless we assumed sort of automatically that the vast majority of people on the road are going to behave in accordance with the expectations put upon them by the public institutions. Our entire, everything we do depends upon assuming that, right? If I had to know the individual personality and state of mind and possible behaviors of each and every person on the road, because there were no public institutions, there were no lines, there were no traffic laws or whatever. I just have to get out there and kind of try and figure out who I'm up against today, engage it. The whole situation would be much more complicated. Right? Public institutions, you might say, routinize our interactions. They act as a social lubricant that allows the population to interact without having to develop personal relationships, which take time. And those kinds of things are invaluable for large settlements. Large urban settlements need public institutions because you're going to have a large number of people there. It's not like a tiny little farming village where everybody knows everybody. Right? I went to a very small high school, private high school, 400 people in the whole high school, 98 people in my graduating class. I knew everybody in my graduating class personally. I may not have known them super well, But I knew all of them personally, and I knew most of the people in the classes on either side of me. But if you go to a very, very large high school, a friend of mine went to a high school with 1,600 people, just in his graduating class, right? It was huge. There were like 5,000, 6,000 total. It was enormous. There was one principal, but there were 4 vice principals. Each had a wing of the school that they were responsible for. It was just an enormous institution. And he only knew a small handful of people. He only had personal interactions with this small handful of people that were in his private sphere. Everybody else he interacted with only in the public sense, in the impersonal sense, mediated by these institutions. And I imagine that's what it would be like, the difference between living in a very small town and living in a large city, right? I mean, I've done both, although when I lived in a small town, I didn't really get to know anyone because I never went out. But, hypothetically, if you live in a small farming community, it's possible to know most or all of your neighbors at least fairly well. And your interactions with them can be personal rather than impersonal and mediated through the public institutions. Whereas if you live in a large city, of necessity, the vast majority of people you interact with, you are going to interact with impersonally. There will be a small group of people in your private sphere, but that's it. Okay. So why am I telling you all this? Why am I digging into social psychology? Well, the reason is public institutions and social institutions that mediate interaction between people in society. First of all, they require a functioning government, a functioning state of some kind, right? Remember the thing about why can I predict the behavior of other people on the road? Because we all got the same driver education. Why did we get the same driver education? We had to get a license. Why do we need a license? Because we'll get pulled over if we don't. How do we know we'll get pulled over? Because there are police who are watching for bad driving and will pull us over. And they will and there are courts that will lock us away, right? If we drive too poorly, right? The expectation, the ability to predict and expect certain behaviors out of other people, routinized behaviors, instilled upon them by the public institutions. It depends upon a vast network of public institutions, things that create and maintain and propagate the norms of behavior. Everything from the people who paint the lines on the road, all the way up to the judges that sit in traffic courts, and everything in between. Okay? Even the legislators who write the traffic laws. All of this, all of these institutions have to be functioning and working together in the right way to create that public sphere where we have a public persona, where when I get on the road, I am an American driver rather than just myself, right? My hopes and dreams. I've always wanted to see Paris. I have, it's lovely. No, my hopes and dreams are not important to the people on the road. They don't give a shit. They don't know anything about them, and rightly so. All they need to know is that I have been educated in the same driving laws that they have, and I'm probably going to follow them. Awesome. That's literally all they need to know about me. They don't know me. They know the public-facing version of me. Okay. So, but the existence of that public me, the existence of that public persona, depends upon the institutions that create the public sphere. And the public sphere is mostly useful, is mostly required, even, in large urban settlements. Now, if you've been paying attention and thinking ahead and remembering the last video about the collapse of Rome and the beginning of the Dark Ages, then maybe you're a little bit ahead of me. Because if you recall, what I said happened was, A, urban population dwindled dramatically to the point where some urban settlements vanished entirely, and others simply reverted to small farming settlements. And due to the dysfunction at the top levels of the government, the public institutions vanished, right? No one could collect taxes, no one to report to. I mean, imagine if you were the guy or girl who paints the lines on the road, right? You know it's important, but no one's collected taxes, so you don't know when you're getting paid. And the emperor has been assassinated like every 5 seconds, and every new emperor puts in new people loyal to them. And now, like, they're fighting it out over the offices. You literally don't know who your boss is. Or are you just going to keep painting lines on the road, hoping it will get better? Or are you going to say, screw this, I'm going to go get a piece of land somewhere that I can farm, because I can no longer rely on getting paid and buying my food at the Quick Trip. Right? I'm mixing ancient Rome and modern Tulsa, but you get the idea. The point is, classical Rome. The point is, the public institutions stopped functioning. They degraded, or in some cases completely vanished. And urban populations vanished. Okay. So the public sphere was degraded, and in some cases reduced in scope, and in some cases completely absent in ways that it would not have been in life under the empire. So what is feudalism? Well, how feudalism relates to all of this, public sphere, private sphere talk, is that feudalism is a principle of social organization based on private obligations between individuals. Okay? Now, remember what I said about simple kingship and the Germanic model. In the Germanic model, every adult male was potentially a member of the fighting force, and they had a king who combined both a religious role, who was sort of a leader in religious ceremonies to the old German gods before they converted to Christianity, I guess, and who was also their war leader. And so the king and his closest companions, who were the best warriors, are basically in charge. But this simple kingship model works over small tribal areas, where basically everyone that you rule over is more or less within the immediate reach, your immediate reach, within a day or so, maybe. What happens is that the simple kingship model, simple kingship is a form of government. Simple kingship fused with feudalism, which is not a form of government, but a way of organizing society. And what happens is, in the very earliest phase of feudal development, the client-patron system of the old Roman society, the client-patron system turns into a system of vassal and lord. Okay, in old Roman society, part of the corruption of Roman Republican society that continued into Roman imperial society was that people with money could evade the official ways of being done so effectively that the official channels, these public institutions, kind of required corruption and bribery and influence peddling in order to operate. And if you were poor and couldn't afford those kinds of things, bribes and influence peddling, what you would do was you would find a rich person in Rome who wanted your people to vote his way, and then in exchange for voting their way in all the elections, they would get things done for you. Okay, so that happens when institutions are corrupt, as in Rome. But when the institutions are gone, what's left is still the general structure, the general shape or outline of this system. And you have poor people who no longer enjoy the protection of the Roman military or the Roman legal institutions. And they need something, right? If they just farm their land and try to mind their own business, somebody with a sword is going to come take their food from them, right? What they need is someone who is a warrior to protect them. And so the Germanic kings and their immediate subordinates would accept pledges of loyalty, and specifically pledges of food, right? The farmers would have to divert a portion of their crop to maintaining the warrior class. And in return, the warrior class would protect them from anybody else. And if you're thinking this sounds a little bit like the mob running a protection scheme, it kind of is, right? This is basically organized crime. This is extortion. They're like, hey, you know, it's a nice farm you got there. Shame if something happened to it. You know, it's kind of like that, right? And from now on, in my head, all knights are going to talk like Mafia Goombas in a 1970s mob movie, right? That's, in my head, that's how it's going to go. Bunch of knights standing there, hey, Benny! Let's go on horses and have a joust. What do you mean a joust? Let's have a joust. You know, anyway, I think it's funny. You don't have to think it's funny. I think it's funny. And that's really enough. Anyway, so the public sphere disappears, leaving only private relations. And that means establishing a private relation or an individual one-to-one compact with someone more powerful than you for protection, someone who can actually bring justice. If somebody murders your family member, right, you're a poor peon, you're a farmer, you're a nobody, right? You got no weapons, except maybe a shitty little spear. You don't know how to fight, really. Somebody murders a member of your family. What are you going to do about it? Well, either you can try and go get revenge yourself, or you can rely on this private compact that you've established between you and someone more powerful than you, a member of the military class. You are the vassal who makes a pledge of loyalty, and the member of the military class is your lord, who makes a pledge of protection and support. So, the lord lets you farm the land that they technically own, and even if you owned it to begin with, now it's kind of theirs because they have a sword and you don't. The farmer lets you farm the warrior lets you farm the land. You give them some of the food, and in return, they protect you and they bring justice, right? If you need justice, you can go to when the Lord is holding court. Court, you can go to court. Does that sound familiar? Ah, right? You can go to a court of justice and petition the Lord. Hey, this dipshit killed one of my friends or my family members. And they'll go, oh, cool. Or, sorry, they're Goombas. They'll go, yeah, we'll take care of him for you. You know, whatever, right? And that's how it works. But it's all based on a private relationship because there's no public institution, right? If you're imagining a king that rules over, if you're imagining something like a modern government with offices and you know, bunches of bureaucracy and stuff like that, that just happens to have a king in charge of it instead of like a president or a chief executive or a prime minister, then what you're imagining happens much, much later. That happens like after the feudal era. And partially by definition, because the medieval era is defined by feudalism, by the lack of public institutions. When we get to the point where public institutions have recovered, and the nobility, the kings and dukes and barons and what have you, are just in charge of a functionally modern set of public institutions, then that is no longer the medieval era. Okay. And it's no longer feudal. So, the medieval era is defined, one of the main defining elements is feudalism. That with the public institutions gone, powerful people, military people, start establishing individual one-on-one compacts of service and loyalty, of vassalage and lordship, Okay, that is the first level of what is called infugation, the feudalisming of society, if you will. Infugation, as awkward as that is, it's better than the alternatives. The infugation of society. Okay, that's level 1. So that's part of it. Now, what are some of the other defining features of the medieval era? Well, obviously, lack of public institutions and feudalism go hand in hand, because it's only because of the lack of public institutions that we get feudalism. Similarly, a defining element of the medieval era is rule, or a thoroughly militarized society. The fighting class is in charge of everything, and there is no professional army, right? There are no people who are soldiers and that's their job and they're over here, right? Fighting is kind of the foundational concept of this society. The people in charge are the top level, the apex fighters, and the peasants, in times of war, they're drafted to fight. But yeah, even they have to fight. So it's a thoroughly militarized society, top to bottom. And that goes hand in hand with feudalism. So you can see the chain, right? The lack of public institutions results directly in feudalism. But feudalism exists, because feudalism exists, it is a militarized society. You get it? Because with no public institutions, who are you going to be making these private compacts of vassalage with? Who is going to be the lord? It's going to be the person who can fight. Because there are no public institutions, right? In Rome, the patrons in the patron-client system, the people who sort of had their hands on the levers of power in Rome, were generally civilians, right? They were scholars, they were lawyers, they were politicians. Warriors, fighters, soldiers, those were professionals, right? Rome had a professional paid army that was trained and equipped to do the fighting, but civilians ran everything because they had access to and could understand and manipulate the public institutions. But with no public institutions, with the only law of the land being who has a sword and what the hell do they want, you're going to make your private contract with somebody with a sword. So, in the medieval era, no public institutions, or very few anyway. Public sphere almost entirely gone. The society is organized along a system of individual compacts of vassalage and lordship. That is to say, feudal ties. It comes from a French word. Feudalism comes from a French word that means oath or promise, right? And so feudalism literally, to translate it literally out of the French would just mean oathism, promiseism, a society based on promises, individual arrangements. And the people who were controlling those arrangements, the ones who benefited the most from them and who set the terms, were the people who could fight, because it was chaos, it was anarchy, it was a thoroughly militarized society, right? You take what you want by force. Okay, so, no public institutions, feudalism, militarization of society. Okay, all right, we're getting somewhere. We're getting a sense of the core nature of medieval society, right? We're getting our hands around what were the essential features of it. Now, knights? No, it didn't have to look exactly like that. It didn't have to be guys on horseback with helmets and a lance, right? It could have been something else entirely, right? Maybe if there were no horses, it still would have been feudalism, as long as there's this lack of public institutions that is causing people to make individual compacts with the leaders, and the leaders are militarized. They're of the fighting class because of the lack of public institutions. Okay. Now, was Germanic society prior to the medieval era feudal? And the answer is no, not really. Simple kingship, as it existed in Mycenaean Greece, and in the Germanic society in Roman imperial period, society was small enough that, or the social units were small enough, rather, that there were no individual arrangements between the king in simple kingship and the lords. It was just the way it was, right? Everybody knew. It was like a clan system, right? A system of extended kinship, where people who sort of had enough kinship networks, groups of families that were all related to each other by culture and blood, and they just sort of clove together, and the king was sort of picked out from among the leading families and had to negotiate with the elder males of the leading families in order to get anything done. It was kind of like that. It was based on a family structure. That's how power was exercised, through the family unit. Whereas, in feudalism, one of the elements there is that there is a slight element of impersonal, there's a slightly impersonal element to it, in the fact that the king in a feudal system accepts these arrangements sort of from anybody, right? You don't have to be closely related or in the same clan or what have you, right? The king can potentially accept an oath of loyalty and can extend an offer of vassalage to anyone. So feudalism, as a principle for organizing society, has the potential to allow the ruler to extend their territory in terms of sort of what people will accept culturally. It has the potential to allow them to extend their territory beyond the immediate ancestral boundaries defined by blood and culture and history. Okay, which makes conquest of an enemy's territory a much more attractive option. Alright. So, these are the core elements of feudalism, or the medieval era. Feudalism, lack of social institutions, thoroughly militarized society. Alright. In the period after the fall of Rome, we see early infeudation in what would now be southern France with the Merovingians. We see Frankish kingdoms arise, and so on and so forth. And there were lots of kings. A king just meant you didn't answer to anyone. Basically, you didn't have any vassal, or you weren't a vassal to anyone else. So, as long as you had a little patch of land where you were the tough kid, and nobody else was sort of you didn't owe allegiance to anybody else, you're a king. And there were tons of kings, and they were fighting over supremacy and trying to take over territory. And it was really quite nuts. This meant, of course, lots of people were dying. Average lifespan was very low, which is not to say that you were necessarily going to die at 35. That is average lifespan. And if you know about averages, all that means is there was quite a good chance that you would die as a child, and then if you make it to adulthood, there was still a pretty decent chance you would die by violence. So, yeah, not good. It was a violent time. There wasn't a lot of travel. There wasn't a lot of trade. Since trade is one of the main things that sustains urban populations, there was not much in the way of an urban population. These are characteristics of the feudal or of the medieval era, but they are not essential characteristics. These characteristics sort of are consequences of the essential characteristics. Right? When you have a thoroughly militarized society with no public institutions, those are the essential characteristics. Then it so happens that you're probably going to have a lot of violence, not much trade, not much urban population, not much literacy, etc. You see what I mean? The essential characteristics are the things that caused sort of the secondary characteristics of medieval society. Okay, so the early part of the medieval era, which we call the Dark Ages, that I talked about in the last video, these characteristics are pretty much what you see on the tin, right? It's pretty much as described. But society in Europe would start to change along about the 11th century, I guess say the 1000s. So that by the time we come out on the other side, into the 12th century, the 1100s, and especially into the 13th century, the early 1200s, we are fully into what is called the High Middle Ages, where medieval culture was flourishing and kind of on its way out of medievalness. And the funny thing is, most of the things that you associate with medieval times, which is, full suits of plate armor and jousts as sort of a public sport, right? Jousting is kind of a sport, and lots of nobility, layers of nobility, like counts and dukes and barons and baronets and marquises and so on and so forth. All these various noble titles and big stone castles, and the church as this kind of all-powerful force that is influencing the medieval kings and queens. All of those things are actually features of the High Middle Ages, not the Dark Ages. None of those things were actually present in the Dark Ages. Kings typically ruled over small amounts of territory and could rarely establish a large dominion. And if they did, it wouldn't last probably more than their lifetime or the lifetime of their children. The most stable early medieval, I guess say Dark Ages, the most stable Dark Ages kingdom in England, for instance, the Kingdom of Wessex, really only maintained itself for about 3 generations. From the founding king to their son and their son. And after that, bits and pieces were carved off of it and split up, and fights for supremacy, so on and so forth. There were not, generally speaking, lots of different levels of nobility. There's the king, and then there are the nobles in the Dark Ages, right? If you are a fighting man if you are a male who knows how to fight and with enough money to afford all the right weapons and a horse and shit, you're a noble, right? And that could happen even, it didn't matter what your history of your family was, right? If you're thinking of a society where nobles have this long history that they have to trace to prove, the patents of nobility and whatnot, that's High Middle Ages, man. That's not present in the Dark Ages. Nobody cared how you got your money. Are you wealthy enough to afford all the gear you need to fight? And can you fight? You're a noble. Cool. That makes you a noble. So there weren't all these different levels. Phrases like count, titles like count and duke and stuff existed in kind of a proto-format, but often they were interchangeable with king, right? Duke especially. Duke comes from a Latin word meaning general, right? A war leader, the dux. The duke is a leader and essentially a powerful noble who is responsible to no one. Now in the High Middle Ages era, what's going to happen is people are going to start establishing large realms that are stable enough that, remember what I said about kings and other nobles taking the oaths of vassalage from people outside of their immediate sort of clan, their immediate extended kinship network? Well, as we get into the High Middle Ages, thanks to agricultural surpluses and some other exogenous factors, like the fact that Vikings had sort of stopped attacking all the time, Powerful nobles are going to start establishing areas large enough that they will need layers of what's called subfugation, right? So you'll have farmers who report to a lord, and that's their lord, right? They're the vassals of one lord, but then that guy will be a vassal of like a greater lord who's like his district manager, kind of. And then those greater lords will be the vassal of a king, right? Or maybe even another layer in between, right? There might even be, 3 or 4 layers. But all of these noble titles sort of come into existence in a haphazard fashion as certain fighting kings or lords or powerful nobles, in fact, rich people with weapons, are able to establish large and relatively stable regimes. And they they don't have a bureaucracy because there aren't any public institutions, right? And there's not a lot of literacy, right? So what they have instead is subfugation or subinfugation. They have vassals who have their own vassals, and then all the way down to the poor people for farming, who are now in a friggin' pyramid scheme, and their food is supporting the guy who is also supporting someone above him, who's supporting someone above him, and so on and so forth. So it gets very complex. But that happens in the High Middle Ages. So again, if you're picturing that, that's something in the High Middle Ages. If you're picturing jousting as a sport, right, that's something that happens in the High Middle Ages. Because in the Dark Ages, things were not stable enough for jousting to be a friggin' sport, right? If you were charging at someone with a spear on horseback, you were trying to kill them, not knock them off for fun, right? That's a leisure activity. People were living on the edge of chaos, man. No. High Middle Ages, weirdly enough, are a period where feudal Europe had settled down to a point where urban populations were starting to regenerate, trade was starting to pick back up, literacy and craftsmanship were starting to pick back up, just in the way that it did in Greece after the Greek Dark Ages, right? All these things are starting to recover. There are still no public institutions per se, more or less, but the nobles are trying to establish a sort of makeshift bureaucracy out of other nobles, right? Where I'm a king, and I have some powerful nobles who administer regions for me, and they have nobles under them who administer smaller regions, and so on and so forth. Like Russian nesting dolls or something. So what we're starting to see in the High Middle Ages, to put, not to put too fine a point on it, what we're starting to see in the High Middle Ages is a society that is becoming less medieval, right? Where something like public institutions are coming back into play. And indeed, by the time we get to, say, the late 1400s or the early 1500s, we will start to see in Paris, the French king by that period had a royal bureaucracy that bypassed the nobles, that did most of the actual work of running the country. We will see in England, we will see a privy council that is made up of nobles for the most part, but also made up of people who are not nobles, who were only made nobles especially for the purpose of being in the privy council, right? They're not landholders at all. They administer something like a primitive kind of professional bureaucracy, and therefore public institutions, right? We will see powerful nobles, powerful kings that have centralized their authority, that allow them to promulgate laws for their entire kingdoms, which is very rare, almost non-existent in the Dark Ages, right? A king can rule over their direct area, and they must exert direct control over it, but without sub-infeudation, right, they don't have a very large area that they can control, and with sub-infeudation, the areas that they control are much more loyal to the lord that is closest to them, rather than to a remote king. The development of a professional bureaucracy to support the ruler, the king, is necessary to create and promulgate and enforce laws over the entire kingdom, which then creates public institutions. So, the funny thing about the High Middle Ages after the 11th century is that although that's the thing that we think of mostly, all of the things that we think of when we think about the Middle Ages, it is actually the High Middle Ages between the end of the 11th century and, say, the beginning of the 16th century, so about 400 or 500 years, is the process of the feudal order unraveling. That is the period of time in which the feudal order is becoming less and less relevant to the kind of society they actually have. Which is funny to me, because that's the thing we think of as paradigmatically medieval. But in a way, it's not. What is paradigmatically medieval is the Dark Ages, right? The more purely feudal societies, the more purely rural rather than urban societies. But in the High Middle Ages, all that's coming undone. Society is kind of climbing back out of that Dark Ages hole after the collapse of Rome. It's headed back towards public institutions, trade, literacy, urban society, all those things they had in Rome, but it's stuck with all of these people from a warrior class who are now superfluous to requirement. Right? Their function in society is becoming obviated by the changing nature of society. But they don't want to, they're not just going to go, oh, well, I see you guys don't need us anymore. I'm going to give up my enormous wealth, prestige, and power and ride off into the sunset. That's not going to happen. They're going to cling to power as hard as they can. You know? So, that's the contrast between the Dark Ages, which is sort of the more properly medieval era, the early medieval era, and the High Middle Ages, the latter part of the medieval era, which ends anywhere from 1450 to 1500, maybe 1550, somewhere thereabouts. So if we started between 500 and 600, and we ended between 1400 and 1500, then we got something around 1,000 years. And it's split almost neatly into two halves, the Dark Ages and the High Middle Ages. Okay, so, let's see here. Alright, so the transition to the High Middle Ages. I'll talk about that for a bit before we finish. The transition to the High Middle Ages is what some scholars call the 11th century miracle. But there's a number of factors sort of came together in the 11th century that precipitated a very rapid change in society. And that's a fancy way of saying that society between the year 1000, or European society between the year 1000 and 1100, just in that 100 years, looked very, very different. Okay. When you roll into 1000, and you have a thoroughly feudal society. Kings with small-scale domains. Yeah, Charlemagne managed to unite most of Europe in the Holy Roman Empire, but then it fell apart right away. Generally speaking, kings with small-scale domains. In England, the Kingdom of Wessex is sort of the main holdout against the Vikings, who spent a lot of time invading and have actually invaded and settled the eastern part the southeastern part of England, which is called the Danelaw, or the place where the Danish laws are in effect. The Danelaw. That alone, of course, all the way through the 9th century and the 10th century, we had a lot of Viking raids, right? From the Scandinavian areas, you had Vikings raiding everywhere, which pushed the previously scattered peasant settlements closer together. Not quite in urban areas, but it did help revitalize urban life a little bit. And it speeded along the process of sub-imputation. In any case, what happens as we're rolling into 1000 is that the Vikings are not raiding so much as they are starting to settle places. Right? A little bit, it's already ongoing by this point. As I said, it's happening in England, it's happening in Iceland, and Ireland. Or it will be happening in Ireland soon, one way or the other. It's happened in, when did the Vikings settle down?
Ask me that.
You know that.
I know I don't do dates.
Fair. Anyway, it was sometime around then, though.
What do I know?
All right. I should probably censor that, but anyway, whatever. Well, we'll see. In any case, the Vikings, the Scandinavians, who were previously raiding for most of the last century, were starting to settle. The pressures, population pressures in their homeland drove them first to try to import resources by force, if you might say, and then when that was not enough of a solution, to simply, for large portions of their population, simply leave and find other suitable places to live. So rather than raiding, they were settling, which still, annoyed the locals, but it was less disruptive than raiding. So we no longer had Viking raids to deal with. The church was becoming more powerful. Now, throughout the entirety of the Dark Ages, the Christian church, of course, existed all over Europe, but there was a lot of dispute about, what the exact correct dogma was. Different people believed different things. But you have three sort of elements working together to create a strong church. First of all, in Rome and North Italy in general, they never descended totally into feudalism. This was the heart of the Roman Empire. And while the Roman Empire did fall, the fact of the matter is, the fall of the Roman Empire was the hardest on the places outlined, the furthest edges of it. In the heart of the empire, they managed to maintain a fair bit of urban culture, literacy, and so on and so forth, even to the point that public institutions were not totally degraded. But without the authority of a Roman Empire, the public institutions in Rome and the surrounding areas were largely subordinated to and absorbed by the church. So the North Italian church, the Roman church especially, the power structure of the church has kind of absorbed the functions of the public institutions in this region. And it is trying to extend that influence of providing a sort of, an alternative court of justice, an alternative standard of morality, an alternative source of obligation, rather than just the military feudal obligations to the temporal lords. It is attempting to extend that all over Europe. Now, the temporal lords, which is, say, the guys with swords, were well aware of the fact that loyalty to the church could take away from loyalty to them. And they thus sought to control the church by making appointments to the church by force. It was assumed during the Dark Ages that whatever guy with a sword ruled over a particular piece of land, he got to appoint the priests and the bishops and so forth. And it didn't matter if they were trained priests or members of the church or what. He would just do that. Now, this is in part, this was accepted partially due to the fact that in the Germanic tradition, the king had a religious as well as a a very practical role in terms of meting out justice and warfare and protection. The king had a religious role. The king was the focal point of religious ceremonies and was invested with a kind of religious authority. Now, that didn't change when the Germans converted to Christianity. They simply assumed that the king had some sort of divine ordination. And this worked within their scheme of vassalage in the sense that just as the peasants accepted oaths of vassalage to the king was seen, in a sense, as a vassal of God. And so the church was, you might say, the one that interpreted the king's duties and kept them honest, if you will. But the church, the people doing this, were usually appointed by the king himself. So, it's pretty rare for them to go against that. So, you've got this sense where the kings who are relying on a Germanic tradition to establish this new feudal order, right? The kings were using Christian dogma to sort of legitimize their rule, which was new, right? Rome was attempting to wrest from the European kings the control over the interpretation of this dogma. Because here's the thing, if I'm a king and I say, oh, I'm king because God wants me to be king, then that's all well and good if I control what all the priests are doing, if I make sure I'm in control of my local church. But imagine if my local church is no longer just a local church. Imagine if my priest thinks that his obligation is to report back to Rome. Well, now, because I'm using Christian beliefs to justify my rule, in a sense, I'm now obligated to Rome too, right? I've hooked myself to that wagon. Okay, so one sort of power, one sort of nexus of power in this struggle over cultural and social supremacy was the church in Rome, and another sort of node of power in the same struggle was in Ireland, where the Irish monastic tradition did an enormous job of preserving documents and formalizing dogmas and basically creating almost creating out of whole cloth the basis of European Christianity, the sort of formal structural basis of it, rather than having a Christianity that was just defined by the local guy with a sword, right, and whoever talking head he put in the pulpit. The Irish monks did an enormously influential job of creating a kind of standard view of what it was to be Christian and to live a Christian life and to be a Christian ruler and things like that. So, all of this will culminate in the 11th century, where, as you'll see in the Crusades video, a series of popes, that is to say bishops of Rome, the sort of top dog in Christian faith at that time, a series of popes who were super serious, like totally serial, you guys, serial, who were super serial about getting the other churches in Europe to all acknowledge the supreme authority of the Pope. They came into power, and there were several of them right in a row, so they were able to build on each other's accomplishments. And they did a magnificent job of, again, with the sort of counterweight of the Irish monastic tradition sort of pumping out documents. They weren't in collusion, but they wound up working sort of at the same purpose. They managed to get a sort of, pretty much a consensus. They had managed by the 11th century to sort of revert control over the various European churches to ultimately root it to the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. And again, if you're thinking of a medieval society where the Pope is like the ultimate religious authority that controls every church and they all obey him. High Middle Ages, right? Dark Ages, not like that. So all of this culminates, again, as you see in the Crusades videos, in 1093 or 1095, I can't remember which one, where the Pope, Pope Urban, tries to flex his power. He wants to take this influence out for a spin. And he finds that it is enormous, that he has more power than he thought he had. The common people believe completely and totally in the Christian church. And the Christian church by this time is pretty much completely and totally loyal to Rome, rather than to the local rulers. So when the Pope says, do this, the call for crusade, it doesn't just go out to North Italy. The call for crusade goes out across Europe to every church, and the local priests and bishops preach the crusade, and the common people are like, yes, crusade! And the nobles are kind of like, I will not be accepted as a legitimate noble if I don't do this. Right? I'm sure some of them were also true believers, but at the very least, they had to acknowledge that their legitimacy, the legitimacy of their rule, was now subject to the Pope's approval. And by the way, this would be tested on several occasions. In the Dark Ages, you never hear of a Pope excommunicating a king. Right? In the High Middle Ages, it starts happening a lot. Popes start excommunicating kings or threatening to excommunicate kings, and the kings have to seriously think about, oh shit, what will happen if the Pope does that to me, because my people, my lands will be under interdict. No one will be able to receive communion. All of my peasants will fear for the safety of their souls. There will be riots. I won't get my crops in. The Pope basically had managed to seize the moral high ground, the spiritual authority, the legitimizing authority. And so the center of power had kind of shifted. But that also meant that the papacy and the Christian church was, in that sense, a kind of a public institution, right? It wasn't a completely public institution, but it was similar to one. It was outside of the usual feudal structure. Individuals were born and baptized into the church. They didn't make an arrangement. They didn't swear fealty to the church. It's just a thing. It was just the thing that it was. It just existed. Right? Kind of like how if you're born in America, you're an American citizen and subject to its laws. But you didn't ask for that, it just happened. So the Pope had created a kind of a public institution. Okay? And we'll see in the Crusades videos about how the Pope used that power in the first go-around to kind of export a lot of the violence. Right? The Pope knew he was dealing with a militarized society. And in a militarized society, where the rulers, their whole job description is to fight, what happens when things start to get more settled and more peaceful? They're still going to want someone to fight. They have to justify their existence, right? Okay. So the Pope managed to kind of export a lot of their violence. He said, hey, you shouldn't kill other Christians, but it's totally okay to kill non-Christians, which I'm sure I remember Jesus saying, right? Anyway. So the Pope exports the violence inherent in the system. It's a little Monty Python joke for you. The Pope exports the violence inherent in the system, and as a result, by the end of the 11th century, we've got, thanks to a public institution that can mediate disputes, right? If two nobles have a beef with each other, rather than simply fighting, which they would have done before, they now have an institution that they can both appeal to for justice, a public institution in a sense, the church. That helps bring down the level of violence. The exporting of the violence inherent in the system helps bring down the level of violence. Viking raids have stopped, which allows productivity to be on the upswing. The weather was super good during the 11th century. There were big agricultural surpluses, which helped the population boom and helped support more of an urban population. Okay? Urban populations mean advanced craftsmanship, mean literacy. Advanced craftsmanship and literacy means trade. which is now possible thanks to the reduced level of violence, long-distance trade. All of these factors are working together, right? So that's at the beginning of the 11th century. In the year 1000, you had a thoroughly feudalized society, thoroughly feudal society. By the year 1100, and certainly by the year 1150, you have a lot less violence between nobles because they have kind of a sort of pseudo-public institution, the church, rather than it just being something under direct control of individual nobles. It is a legitimate institution separate from their power. You've got urban life is reviving, you've got trade reviving, cultural production is going up, and the need for a military class to be in charge of everything is slowly unraveling, right? It is coming to the point over the course of the High Middle Ages where what will be needed are administrators and people who can run land and collect taxes a lot less than people who can fight. And in fact, a lot of the wars of the High Middle Ages were really just kind of pointless, right? It was just the military class amusing itself, if you will. But because they are becoming much less, their role as soldiers, their role as fighters, is becoming less relevant, and they don't want to give up power, they need a way to distinguish themselves. Especially as now, wealth is no longer solely associated with being a military figure. Their own wealth doesn't mean that they're going to be fighting, right? Because with trade and urbanization and literacy, we start to get professional armies again, okay? So this military class is becoming less and less relevant as a military class, but they don't want to give up power, so they need a way to distinguish themselves. And here comes one of the last sort of innovations of the High Middle Ages that you will recognize, no doubt, which is the idea of nobility, not as a social class that you occupy by virtue of being wealthy enough to afford fighting gear and being able to fight. It's not a thing you do. It is who you are. It is in your blood, right? The nobility of Europe began to distinguish themselves as a special kind of person, different from and essentially separate from everybody else. And they deserve to rule by right of that nobility of blood, which preserves their prerogative even as they are being made obsolete on the battlefield. Even as an individual noble may have no role in fighting, and in fact employs a professional army to do all his fighting for him. He can still claim to be the one in charge, not because he's a warrior, which would have been the case in the Dark Ages, but because he has special noble blood or whatever bullshit, right? This is a high medieval thing. Again, another trope of medieval fiction and historical fiction, this idea of nobility and the peasants being completely inseparable, not something you would have seen in the Dark Ages. No one cared in the Dark Ages. If you could fight and you had your kit and you had enough money to sustain your horse and your kit, you were a noble, because that's what a noble was. Whereas in the High Middle Ages, desperate to hold on to their relevance, nobility was transformed from a thing you do into a thing you are. So, okay. That's really all I've got time for. I've actually gone over my time. That's all I've got time for in this lecture. We'll talk more about the innovations of the High Middle Ages, including higher education, chivalry, how we get the recovery of bureaucracy and more robust social institutions and all that stuff in the next video. But until then, have a good day, be well, don't die, all that stuff. Yeah.